Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, EQ Executive Coaching. My name is Trish, and I'm a Talent Solutions Consultant here at MHS. I'll be getting us started before we pass it over to our presenter, Dana Ackley. To begin, let's go over a few logistics. To keep background noise to a minimum, you are all on mute. We want your questions, so there is a question pane in the webinar panel where you can enter them at any time throughout the presentation. With time that we have left at the end of the webinar, Dana will answer as many as he can. Lastly, you can view more content and webinars over our YouTube channel, which is displayed here. So be sure to subscribe to see this recording along with all of our other video content. For those on the line new to MHS, a little about us and who we are. Combining the power of people analytics with proven training and development best practices, we help organizations attract, retain, and develop top talent. Located in Toronto, Canada, MHS has been serving clients across the world for over 35 years. In the talent space, we are most widely known for our work in emotional intelligence and specifically the tool EQI 2.0. We offer custom assessment solutions, and our diverse toolkit includes assessments and simulations on personality, leadership, hardiness, entrepreneurship, change management, influence, decision-making, and more. Now about our presenter, Dr. Dana Ackley. Dana earned his PhD in clinical psychology at the Florida State University. For 25 years, he worked with families and community leaders in his private practice. He transitioned to executive coaching and organizational consultation in the mid-1990s using EQ as a foundation for coaching. In 2006, he authored the first comprehensive model for EQ development, the EQ Leader Program, then published by MHS. Dr. Ackley conducts workshops on EQ coaching around the world, and his client list includes a number of large global organizations. Welcome, Dana.
Thanks, Trish. Appreciate being here today.
Thanks for being here. You've been a leading voice regarding emotional intelligence for a long time. What have you noticed about its development over the past 20 years?
Well, I have been working with emotional intelligence since 1999 as I was making my transition out of clinical psychology into the work that I do now. And what I've seen over those years is that the sophistication of emotional intelligence has really grown. It was in danger in the mid-90s of becoming a flavor of the month. But over those years, the theoretical and scientific foundations have become increasingly sophisticated, and this has greatly helped, greatly helped the acceptance of emotional intelligence by the scientific and business communities, both of which were quite skeptical initially. Growing out of that scientific foundation have been outstanding science-based measurements. And there's an article there that measurements of EQ, and there's an article there that is referenced that the audience can get details on. MHS has two of the three best measures of emotional intelligence, and the one that I like best is the Emotional Quotient Inventory. What has been lagging a little bit over these 20 years is the development of systematic methods to build emotional intelligence skills among our clients. And that's really been my focus over the last 20 years, is that kind of work. Okay, so I've got 5 topics that I'd like to talk about. First, I want to talk a little bit about how do we earn coaching and consulting contracts, because nobody gets coached unless we are able to earn some business from organizations. And then I want to talk about program design that is intended to set up coaches for success so that they can stay hired, so that organizations see value and continue to want their involvement. Third, we'll talk about the assessment process, which involves building the participants' motivation for coaching. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the coaching tools that I've developed out of the 22 tools total that I have, and then talk about spin-off work that can generate additional revenue for coaches. And as they say in the song, we have a long way to go and a short time to get there, so we better get started. And for those who want more information than we can do in an hour, we have I'll talk at the end about an in-person workshop that we're going to do in October. So let's start with the definition. What do we mean by EQ coaching? And basically, we're talking about executive coaching broadly defined, with the EQ part as a foundation. And we're helping clients to build specific skills of emotional intelligence that will help facilitate their success. So the process involves identifying key areas for development out of our assessment, and then working with our coaching client to create a plan that we both feel good about. We do the coaching, and whenever possible, we want to have the manager involved because they can help us get real-time feedback from clients about the client's progress. And I like to have three-way meetings so that the manager and the client and I can sit down and see how things are going and to agree on the goals of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. But EQ coaching is not just limited to discussions about EQ. In my work with clients, EQ becomes a gateway to all of the issues that executive coaches typically have with their clients. So the reality is that nobody wants to build EQ skills. Executives don't want to do that. What they want are the results of building EQ skills. For example, they want to have influence. Leaders need to be able to influence their followers. Research is quite clear that the quality of influence, the capacity for influence, is directly related to the quality of relationships that leaders have with their followers. So that takes us back to EQ in terms of interpersonal relationships. Executives, leaders need to be good communicators, and that involves the skills of empathy and assertiveness. Executives want to have what's called executive presence, whatever in the world that is. It's one of those things that is really difficult to define, but you know it when you see it. And a lot of executive presence is based in the EQ skill of self-regard. And finally, executives need to execute, and impulse control, problem solving, reality testing are all skills that can contribute to excellence in execution. So as we go through this, be thinking about executive coaching broadly, but it includes that foundation and focus on building EQ skills that create success. So, as I said earlier, the first step is that we have to win contracts from organizations. We have to have somebody want us to come in and coach, or nobody gets coached. As Trish indicated, I am a recovering clinician. So for 25 years, I was doing a private practice of clinical psychology in my community. And I live in a relatively small town of Roanoke, Virginia, about 250,000 people in our MSA. So it's not a hotbed of Fortune 500 companies. But as you can see from the list of organizations that are shown on the screen, over the last 20 years, I've had the opportunity to work with all sorts of organizations, from very large companies, healthcare, law enforcement, professional practices, small, one dentist practices. So it's been an interesting 20 years, and I want to share some of the approaches that I have found helpful in being able to get started working with those companies. And I've organized a process into 6 steps that are basically about preparing ourselves to work with those organizations, to get them to be interested in working with us. So think about this like painting a room. If you're going to paint a room, you don't just go start slapping paint on walls. And if you're going to try to sell your services, you don't start by going out and having sales calls. If you're going to paint a room, you've got to do do the taping, you've got to get the tarp down, you've got to get the furniture out of the room and so forth. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at in these 6 steps. The first thing that's important to do is to identify the services that you want to provide. Now, we're talking about coaching today, so it's one thing you probably are going to want to do is provide coaching. But you have to decide, who are you going to coach? Are you interested in coaching Fortune 500 CEOs? Are you interested in coaching dentists and physicians? Are you interested in coaching frontline leaders? Think about who your target market is that you would like to work with, that you're going to be comfortable with, that you're going to be excited about working with. In addition to coaching, we provide other services such as organizational development. In other words, helping organizations mature and to develop aspects that are going to help them be successful. You're going to get involved in selection. What are the kinds of services that you want to provide? So it's important to think that through. The next thing is to identify clients for each service that you want to provide. So what geographical area do you want to serve? I got an early lesson in that. I was chasing work in California at a really nice healthcare system. I wanted to work with them. We went back and forth. And finally somebody said, Dana, do you really want to get on a plane and fly out here every month? And it's a long trip across the country. I don't mind getting on airplanes, but I didn't want to devote that much time to it. And so that helped me rethink my geographical interest to the eastern part of the country. What size of organizations do you want to be working with? Do you want to work with large companies? Do you want to work with smaller companies that are there in your community? What kind of industries are you interested in working with? As an example, I have a colleague who in a former life was a CPA. And she has made herself into one really talented executive coach over the years. And so naturally, the accounting industry is one where she brings a special expertise. So think about your background and how that might line up with helping you to identify the industries within which you would like to work. And now you're beginning to get ready to figure out how you can connect with potential clients. And the key here is relationships. What relationship do you have with people who might be potential clients? And some of you may be thinking, I don't know anybody. I know that's where I was when I started. I believed I didn't have any of those relationships. But I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And then I realized, oh, there was this one guy that I knew that I could go talk with. And after I figured out that I had him, somehow that released my creative thinking. And I came up with other people that I knew. But in addition to that, there's the issue of 6 degrees of separation. So who do you know who might be a client? Who do you know who knows somebody who could be a client? And who do you know who knows somebody who knows somebody, and so forth? Relationships are everything. People do business with people they want to do business with. If you have a relationship with somebody, you are trusted. If you are referred to somebody that they have a relationship with, you're ahead of the competition because you come from a trusted source. And once you figure out how to connect with those clients in terms of who they are, think about, where do your potential clients hang out? Do they hang out at Chamber of Commerce meetings? Do they hang out at the YMCA? Do they hang out on certain parts of the internet? Do they do Facebook? Are there certain journals they like to read? Are there things that you could write so that you can begin to make some of those relationships? The fourth step is to figure out what the value of your services is to your potential clients. Again, they are not looking for EQ services. They are looking for things to solve problems of urgent concern. So it's very important to find out what it is that they care about. What do they believe is essential for their success? And so what I would encourage you to do is to study every target organization as thoroughly as you can. Read everything that you can about them. Talk with people who know the organization. What are the situations that they are facing that are causing them problems or concern? And if you can identify those and then link what you can do for them in order to solve their problems, that's going to mean a lot. As an example, I once worked with a healthcare system that was very concerned about succession planning, and that their executive team was working very cohesively together. And so I got asked to work with the top 7 folks in the organization, below the CEO and COO, to help this team develop its leadership skills and to learn how to work well with each other, because they knew they were in a growth situation and that they were going to be acquiring other healthcare systems in their area, and they knew they had to be ready. The 5th step is to figure out how to communicate the value that you believe that you can provide. And so, of course, there are the traditional things like marketing materials and social media and website and all of that. But what I'd like to focus you on is conversations. If we were all in a room together, and I asked you, how many of you are really eager, really love the idea of going out and making sales calls? I would guess that very few hands would go up. There's something about selling that just creates a lot of anxiety. My brother was vice president of sales for a company that dealt with Fortune 500 companies. He was very successful in his career, and he still talked about the 10,000-pound phone. So that kind of anxiety is normal. What I found worked for me and that I would encourage is, because I had that same level of anxiety, was I'm not selling. I'm simply going out to have conversations with people. And if I were to ask this group, well, how many of you like having conversations? Probably all of your hands would go up because we're coaches. We like having conversations. And so that's all we're doing is we're going to go out and talk with some nice people and find out what their interests are and whether there's a connection or not, whether it works or not. Most of the time, it won't. We get more no's than yeses. Fortunately, we don't need that many yeses to build a really good book of business. But people like us tend to take rejection personally. Almost always, it's not about us. When things go wrong, human beings have a habit of making up movies in our head, starring us, when it's really about other issues entirely. Think about going out for these conversations like bass fishing. For those of you who have ever been bass fishing, you know that what you do is you throw the lure out in the water and you reel it back in. Throw it back out and you reel it back in. And if you get 1 strike in 30, well, you're doing pretty well. And so that's the way it is in trying to win business, is that some things work and many of them don't, and not to take it personally. Finally, after you've gone through all of these 5 steps of helping people understand what EQ can do for them, you have to establish your credibility. You have to help them understand what is it that makes you a good source, a credible source of these services. What is there in your history? And what is there in the way that you present yourself in these conversations? Are you using good emotional intelligence? If you're doing most of the talking, you may want to rethink that. If instead you're showing a good deal of empathy and understanding their situation, that's going to go a long way towards making you a credible source of service. As I was putting together the EQ Leader Program, I did a lot of research on what creates sustainable behavior change, which is the goal of executive coaching. And I use that to develop my program design. And there are 10 principles that I used in organizing the programs that I wanted to provide others. We don't have time to go through all 10, but I want to show you some that I found to be particularly important. In his landmark book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. Get started knowing what it is you're trying to accomplish. We are trying to create sustainable behavior change. That's what sustainable behavior change is, what chief learning officers and other buyers have to provide for their organizations, and so that we have to help them do that. It's also important to, whatever extent we can, to have our potential coaching clients participate in our programs in a voluntary way. Now, quite often, like with that story I told you about that healthcare system, the CEO decided that those 7 people would be involved in our program. But in corporate America, executives are used to being volunteered for things. But what has to happen then is that you have to win their motivated participation. The CEO might get them in the room, but you have to get them engaged. And we're going to be talking about how to do that through a number of the slides that are coming up. Part of it, though, is to align with the participants' motivations. What does each participant want out of this program? And our job is to help them get it. But we also have to align with the strategic goals of the organization, or we don't last very long, and we aren't very helpful. And if we don't help their leaders help the organization achieve what it needs to achieve to be successful. This EQ is a growth model. It is not remediation. We are helping people who are already successful become more so. And I always encourage organizations to invest in their winners. I've made the mistake a couple of times of agreeing to coach somebody who had generally poor performance, and they had their proverbial 1 foot out the door and the other foot on the banana peel. And I failed every time. And what happens when you fail in those situations is that your reputation suffers. And they say, well, you can't use so-and-so. He tried to coach Joe and he didn't succeed with Joe. And the fact is that Joe wasn't going to succeed no matter what. So we are helping successful people who already have a good set of skills develop additional skills that are needed to make the most out of their potential. One of the issues that comes up is confidentiality. So my approach is to negotiate with the organization that the assessment results will be confidential to the participant. And I've gotten pushback on that at times, but I've helped the organization understand that they want these results to be confidential, because otherwise the coaching participants are not honest in the assessment process. And so it's a garbage in, garbage out kind of situation. In terms of confidentiality for coaching, normally that is pretty easy to negotiate. What I tell my clients is that what they tell me is between us, with the exceptions of if they let me know they're going to seriously harm themselves, somebody else, or the organization, then I'm going to blab. I'm also going to be open to telling their managers or anybody in authority that the extent to which somebody is engaged in the process. Because if somebody isn't engaged after giving it a good try, then there's no point in going forward. So in terms of the structure, I have put in 3 components, and this is based on research that was done and observations that were made by Carrie Chernus and Daniel Goleman a few years after Goleman's first book came out. When Goleman's first book on EQ came out, every consultant with a pulse developed an EQ workshop. But the reality is that the half-life of a workshop is about 21 days. There is very little sustainable behavior change that happens in a workshop alone. The goal of a workshop is to win hearts and minds and to build their motivation, to get them beginning to get the participants to begin to see, now I can see what EQ can do for me. I can see that it has the potential to build skills and to take me further in my career. Workshops are also an opportunity to initiate the relationship that you have with those participants, because I said earlier, relationships is everything. The next step then can be the EQ assessment. Now, in reality, I've done the EQ assessment sometimes first and then do the workshop. It depends on the organization and what they want and what fits their situation best. But the goals of the EQ assessment are, of course, to figure out what are we going to coach about, what are our initial targets. But it's also another opportunity to build the relationship that you have with this individual, which will be essential in coaching. And third, it is to win commitment to that coaching process. There are a variety of coaching models that all of you have probably been exposed to. But the research is very clear that regardless of the coaching model that you use, it is the quality of the relationship between you and the participant that is going to be the most powerful factor in determining what the outcome is. So everything we're doing and building towards coaching is designed in part to help build those relationships. So in terms of the steps of the assessment, my way to do it is I like to do an interview. I like to do an EQ-based interview that helps me get information and to build that connection so I learn more about this person's personal background, their professional background. I might ask them a few behavioral interview questions around certain specific EQ skills if it seems to be important. I also will then do a formal psychometric assessment. Again, I like to use the EQI 2.0. And then I do a debrief where I give the client the report from MHS, and I give them a couple of days to read it before we meet, and then we sit down and go over the information. I like to find out how they felt about the report and what they thought was accurate, what wasn't accurate. And I never do group debriefs. Instead of it's all one-on-one, because sometimes people get quite disturbed by some of the feedback, and we need to be able to help them move through those concerns. And then finally, we get to coaching, and we figure out with the client and with the organization how we're going to meet. How sessions, you can have hour sessions, hour and a half sessions. Some people have 4-hour sessions. Whatever works for you. Are you going to deliver those in person, video, phone? And then there's always the question of length of engagement. This is going to be. I never accept coaching assignments that last less than 6 months. A year has been more common, and many of my coaching relationships are essentially open-ended and have lasted 3, 4, 5 years. So I thought it might be helpful to talk about an example of a coaching experience that I had to illustrate some of what we're talking about. And the person that I'm going to talk with you about was a pretty high-level person, already quite successful, but the assessment showed that his level of emotional self-awareness was not so great. So now we had a target. We had to think about now what the coaching was going to involve. One of the things that I like to do when folks are limited in a certain area is see if I can figure out with them what is it that has generated the limits that have been created, in this case, in emotional self-awareness. So in our discussions, what I found, this is a man of great faith, and he still is. But he had interpreted his religion that in a way that led him to believe that certain emotions are bad, are immoral, if you will. And what I helped him understand was that emotions are never good or bad. They might be useful or not useful, but they are not moral. Behavior can be good or bad. Behavior can be moral or immoral, but feelings themselves are not. And that gave him permission to notice feelings that he had been trying to hide himself from. The second element was that this person had a sibling who was a long-term drug addicted. And families who have addicts often experience a lot of addiction is about suppressing feelings, and that's contagious. So that folks in the families also get into suppressing their emotions, and he had gotten into that habit. So we talked about these things, and going through this process helped him to normalize his emotions. I then did some training with him about how to recognize what his emotions were, what the three elements are to pay attention to begin to figure out what you're feeling. I have in the EQ Leader program, I've developed exercises for each of the EQ skills. And so I gave him the menu of exercises, 12 or 15 different exercises that are designed to enhance his ability to recognize his emotions. And we picked out the specific exercises that were going to be most useful to him and had him practice them. And then I gave him something that is on the bulletin board of every guidance counselor in every grade school in the country, I think, called Feeling Faces, which is a bunch of emotive faces with the labels of emotions on them. Because one of the problems that people experience with low emotional self-awareness is they don't have good language. So this was a way of giving them language for emotions. Well, he put it right on the bulletin board in his own office and used that as a reminder to pay attention to what it was that he was feeling. Well, the outcome of this and additional coaching that he and I did was that it freed up his creativity and his ability to trust in himself. Because when you're low in self-awareness, you're really mistrusting your own part of your own self. He got promoted, and he'd always been a good leader, but the folks who worked for him became even more enthusiastic followers. And then he got recruited to another company at double his comp. So it worked out fairly well for him. With regard to coaching, in the day and a half workshop that I mentioned at the beginning of our program today, I'll talk about 22 different coaching tools that I have found to be useful. Today, of course, we don't have time for all of that, so I thought I would just focus on 3 of them. And the first one, as you can see, is that clients have to have homework. I love being in coaching meetings. I find them stimulating. I find them exciting. I love connecting with the people I'm working with. But the reality is, coaching meetings only go so far. Their job is to build insight, and maybe to try some things out between the two of us. But it's practice outside of the coaching meeting that is going to build the skills that we're trying to get them to build and create that sustainable behavior change. It takes lots and lots and lots of hours of practice to really get good at something. So as I said, I have specific exercises for each of the 16 EQ skills that the EQI measures, total of 186 exercises. But I also find myself in meetings custom designing an exercise that will fit this person's personality, background, and circumstances, the opportunities that they are likely to have to practice it. And finally, one of the things that I often do at the end of a coaching meeting is I'll say, well, what homework would you like to assign yourself based on what it is that we've talked about today? And quite often they know better than I do what the homework should be. Now, the reality with homework is that sometimes you give the wrong homework, but that's okay. If they go out and they try something out and it doesn't work, or they don't do it, they come back and you can troubleshoot what got in their way. So either way, you can get value out of the homework that you assign. If it works, their practice helps them get better. If it doesn't work, then you can find out more about what the barriers were, what resistance to learning they might be struggling with. I've had a great deal of luck educating people about the brain. And now we're not trying to make them neuroscientists over here. They don't need to know all about the brain, which of course is incredibly complex. But I want them to learn about these 4 parts of the brain. And I point out to them that that the brain, the human brain, has been evolving for about 2 million years. And evolution is a problem-solving process. So the human brain has evolved to solve problems throughout our human existence. And you can see there on the chart that the limbic system is down near the brainstem. And what that means is that it evolved early. And the implication of that is that when we confront a situation, the limbic system is the center of emotions. So we typically respond to emotions first with an emotional response. And sometimes the amygdala is a part of that, and the amygdala is the part of our brain that generates threat. The cortex up on top of our heads is the logic center. And we really like to think that we make decisions all very logically, but the reality is that we often have an emotional reaction to a situation and then rationalize our decision, our emotional decision, using our cortex. And when people can understand that this is just how the brain works, it frees them up to be more open to their own reactions to things. And it takes away a great deal of defensiveness. And what we're really trying to do is to help people move into their prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of emotional intelligence. Because it's the job of the prefrontal cortex to integrate logic and emotion. And that's when we function at our peak. We can define emotional intelligence as the intelligent use of emotion. And so, for example, if we find that we're having a certain emotion and that it's helping us to accomplish the task that we're involved with, then we should go with it. But if we're having an emotion that is getting in the way of our succeeding, maybe if we're too anxious or too angry about something, then we need to figure out, and that's getting in our way of succeeding, then we need to figure out some way to change the way that we're feeling. So as people understand more about the prefrontal cortex, and it takes a little longer for it to kick in because it's dealing with more complex data, it helps them become more successful in actually using it. And the third tool that I'll talk about today is that I like to link behaviors today that are getting in the individual's way with old assumptions about how they should relate to the world. Assumptions are nearly out of our beliefs that we have about how the world works that are almost unconscious because they feel so normal to us. And they have developed because they've helped us to succeed in the past, but they may be getting in our way now. So let me give you an example. If you've been coaching for a while, I'm sure that you have dealt with the clients who won't delegate. And so you say, well, you probably ought to delegate more. My client says, you're right, I should go delegate more. And that will have a positive impact for about an hour and a half. But if they've got some beliefs that get in their way of delegating, you've got to get at those beliefs before they're going to be able to really delegate with much success. So one example might be that the client has grown up in a family, and this is why it's good to get some background information, grew up in a family in which depending on other people was kind of dangerous. Not every family is warm and nurturing. Sometimes in some families, if you try to depend on others too much, they get upset with you, they punish you. Um, there are a number of negative outcomes that can happen. If your client grew up in such a situation, the very smartest thing they could do was to become very independent. And now it's manifesting itself in the way they go about their executive duties. So my job then is to make the connection. Oh, here's what's making it difficult for you to delegate to others. And you were really smart in figuring out that you needed to be very independent early on. But now you're in a different circumstance, and different behaviors are going to work better than they did in that old situation. And this is another approach that can take a lot of defensiveness away, because you're not criticizing them for their current behavior. You're helping them to understand it, and then they can more easily move into, in this case, delegating. And the other thing that I like to do with it is to catch them being successful. So even though they're reluctant to delegate, my guess is that you're going to be able to find some times when they have successfully delegated to others, when they've relied on somebody, and to help them know what that feels like and that it was safe and okay. So once you have established trusting relationships with a client and trusting relationships with an organization, it's quite common for them to ask you to do other things that can have great value. And so this is a list of things that my client organizations and my individual coaching clients have asked me to do. Group coaching can be very powerful. It's also economical. So sometimes I'll get asked to coach first line leaders or second line leaders. In other words, leaders that are below the level where it makes economic sense to invest in the individual. And they'll have me coach them as a group after doing an EQ assessment and a workshop and all of that. And the cool thing about group coaching, one cool thing, is that not only do people have access to your expertise as a coach, but they have access to each other's expertise as well. And if they're working together, they can give each other real-time feedback when you're out doing something else. Many clients have asked me to help them develop their team that they lead. And I have had a lot of success integrating EQ and Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team into an effective team building process. So everybody gets an EQ assessment. I do an interview about how the team is functioning, and then we do a retreat and we look at all of that stuff. Clients who lead organizations, who lead a variety of groups, sometimes find that 2 or more of their groups are having conflict. So I will help them figure out how to resolve those conflicts. The EQ I 2.0 has its companion assessment, the EQ 360, which is an excellent 360 assessment tool. But in some organizations, the culture is really in favor of interview-based 360 assessments. And that can be a really a powerful 360 process as well. So that's something that we can talk about more about when we have time. And sometimes organizations will say, we like what you're doing with the coaching. Can you help us around selection in terms of the EQ process? So as I said, in October, we're going to be offering a day and a half to go over all of these topics in more depth. We'll review all of the coaching tools. And what I find in those workshops is that participants often offer other coaching tools that maybe we hadn't thought of. We'll talk about how you can train your coaching clients to coach their direct reports, which is a skill they often find very important. And we'll talk in depth about how to execute those additional services. There are a number of handouts that you can see on the screen there that will help you know how to approach some of these services that we talked about. So you can see a link on the bottom of the screen that could give you more information. And then if you so choose to register, and you can always contact either Trish or me. And now I'll turn it back over to Trish, who has been collecting questions.
Thank you, Dana. I have a couple questions here from the audience.
All right.
The first one is, does a practitioner have to be a licensed therapist to get certified to use the EQI 2.0?
No. I have, okay, so I've been a licensed therapist, and I have seen many coaches come at it from very different points of view, or different kinds of experience. And because they have considerable EQ themselves and have great sensitivity. And so the EQ 2.0 certification process can give you the foundations of test construction and test interpretation to give you a really good start. So no, you do not have to be a licensed therapist. Some of the best coaches have not been therapists.
Okay. The second question is, would you think training and mindfulness would provide clients with tools to self-evaluate and self-regulate, which is more effective than us telling them what behavior they need to change?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And so I would argue that it's a mix. That mindfulness can facilitate self-awareness, which is a really huge tool. And mindfulness is exceptionally useful. So I'm very much supportive of that being a part of one's involvement with their clients. But I would also argue that it's very difficult to see ourselves fully as others see us. So on the one hand, I think coaches who just give advice are really limiting themselves. In my experience, it's really helpful to have an interplay between the feedback that we can give folks, the 360 assessments can give folks, and what they can figure out for themselves through something like mindfulness. So I would say the answer to the question is not one or the other, but both.
Okay, that sounds good. That is a great answer, Dana, because I agree with you. It's hard to see ourselves from other people's perspectives. The third question we have is.
I'll just say my wife is somebody who has, for example, if I'm going to do a presentation like the one today, sometimes it's very difficult for me to see what it sounds like. And if I practice with her, she has been just exceptionally helpful at giving me feedback that would stop me from doing a very poor job sometimes. So we need other people. Go ahead, Trish. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. So the third question we have is just coming in. Let me see.
Okay.
How have you influenced clients to understand they need this skill of EQ before truly understanding they need the skill and they need your coaching?
Right. And that is a really core question, because what this question is speaking to is how do we achieve engagement? So if we go back to the three components of the program that I've talked about, if let's say you're doing the workshop first, and so part of what you can do in the workshop is to cite scientific research that demonstrates how various EQ skills facilitate success. Now, everybody in the room is going to want to be successful. So if you can cite research, there are many audiences that find that really powerful. A lot of technically oriented people, engineers, IT people, physicians really like to hear the scientific stuff because it resonates with the way that they think. And so part of helping them to buy into the process is to tune into the way that your potential client thinks, what they value in terms of information, and provide that kind of information to them. An exercise that I've done in many of my workshops is to ask the audience to break up into small groups and to identify which of the 16 EQ skills measured by the EQI 2.0 would best facilitate success in various jobs that their organization has. And what happens then is they're telling me why the EQ stuff works. And they see their colleagues getting invested in it. And that helps build emotional support. We're going through what frankly is a little bit of a scary process. EQ coaching and coaching in general can be challenging because the challenging ways that people have of thinking about the world and asking them to expand them. It's not easy. In the interview for the assessment that I do, but I'm engaging in something that helps them get a feel for what coaching is like. What's it like to actually have a conversation with me? And do they find that to be a good experience, where they can make themselves just a little bit vulnerable and find out that it's okay? That really enhances motivation. And to have themselves listened to, have to hear me or whoever the coach is, understand their concerns and to tie. Well, here's what our coaching could do if we worked on your ability to be assertive. Maybe it will help you have more influence with people who are above you in the chain of command, because you have great talents and you want those people to understand what your contributions are, but maybe you've been a little passive in dealing with it. And that process then gets iterated over time in the coaching work.
Okay, the next question is, what are your thoughts on using EQ as a hiring tool?
It can be quite powerful. It is important to understand how to go about doing that. And I have done some selection work. I've done a lot more coaching, but I have done some selection work. And here is the key. You have to understand what the job is. And then you have to identify what EQ skills are going to contribute to success in that job. There was an old study that maybe many of you have seen on Air Force officers, Air Force recruiters. They were losing 50% of the recruiters every year because they didn't have the right skill set. And so the Air Force had somebody come in and study Air Force recruiters, and they determined that there were 5 EQ skills that when recruiters had them, they were far more likely to fulfill the recruiting quota while working fewer hours. And so that led to what was called the star performer profile. And that's essentially what you want to do to help organizations identify through interviews, through research, what are not all 16 EQ skills are going to be the ones that are most important, but that you have to identify what are the 3, 4, 5 EQ skills that matter in this particular job the most. And then you can do the EQ assessment. EQ, and this is true for any psychological assessment that's involved with selection. It's just one part. It isn't the determining part. The assessment is one of a number of factors that the organization needs to use in order to select the right person. And for your part, you're going to assess which of the candidates fit the model that you have helped the organization build most closely. But should you use it? Yeah, it can be very helpful.
Great, thank you. Do you have any coaching gone wrong examples that taught you what not to do?
Who asked that? Yeah. Yeah. You have to pay attention to the audience. It wasn't that long ago that I did an EQ assessment with an attorney, and he got so upset by the report that I sent him that he wouldn't even talk with me about it. And many attorneys tend to be rather thin-skinned. I have a colleague who coaches only attorneys, and discovered this. And so I had to revise my approach with attorneys in order to be able to work with them successfully. So that's something to think about. Yeah, they aren't all success stories.
Great. Just a couple more questions if we have time. We have a few more minutes. One is, what other principles of program design do you think are important?
Well, one of the things that I include in that is the principle that states, give tools, not shoulds. Many people already have mindfulness, if you will, or self-awareness about where they're limited. So an assessment may lead to us saying to somebody, you're kind of a court low in assertiveness. And they might say, Dana, oh, no kidding, I already knew that. What I really need to know is how to build that assertiveness. And that's our job as coaches, is to provide them tools. They can't think of everything all by themselves. We have to provide tools to help them build that assertiveness, such as exercises, role plays that we might do within coaching sessions, and so forth. A second principle that I would mention is, don't focus your attention just on behavior change. Behavior change, sustainable behavior change, is the ultimate target. We also have to focus on the thoughts and the feelings that drive behaviors, because the leverage for change can be found in all three of those areas. Just telling somebody to change their behavior is likely to lead to a lot of resistance. But if we can help them understand the thinking that they have and the emotions that might be getting in their way, then we can have some real leverage. And finally, I would talk about that it's important to custom design your approach to each client and to each organization. I've discussed here a model, but don't be afraid to adapt the model to the situation that you're seeing, that you are running into. There are coaching programs out there that look to me like factories. Everybody gets marched through the same thing. And I find that troubling. Executive coaching, executive EQ coaching is not factory work, but we're making widgets. We're dealing with individual organizations and human beings with different goals, with different learning styles, different barriers to what's getting in their way, different sources of support, different corporate cultures, and all sorts of other things. So I hope that you find the model I've presented today to be useful, but it's just a model adapted to your organization.
All right. Well, thank you, Dana. We are just under a minute here and we've got a hard stop at noon. So I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today, and everyone for joining. And I'll leave it to you to leave a couple of closing comments.
Well, I just thank you, Trish, and MHS for making this possible. I've enjoyed the process, and I hope that it's been useful. Take care, everybody. Bye now.